Hello, Professor Helmling here. I wanted to record a video version of a lesson that I often give, especially in 1301, but in other classes as well, about grammar and syntax. I think it's really helpful to have a common vocabulary. So I like to go over some terms that might help us in talking about your writing as we do revision, as we look at drafts in progress. It's just good to have some of these terms available to us to talk about. So, starting with the big ones on this slide, grammar and syntax. They're terms that students, of course, have heard and have heard applied to their writing. They've had teachers in the past use them, but don't always have a real solid understanding of the definitions for these. So, the first thing you got to understand is that syntax is actually a part of grammar. See, grammar is the broad term, and it basically covers all the rules of a language, all the rules that govern how a language works. And then syntax is just a part of that. So basically, syntax is about word order. It's about how we arrange words to create phrases and clauses and to create meaning with a language. Whereas grammar covers all of its different rules, including punctuation and spelling and all sorts of different things. So syntax is just part of grammar. Now, to delve into a few other terms that we can use when talking about syntax, I like to use this sentence right here. Writhing in pain, the creature, a breed of chinchilla, previously unknown to science, tried desperately to escape, its eyes scanning the surroundings as its savior lifted its body from the cage. Fun sentence. I had a lot of fun writing that. And so in writing this, I'm trying to cram in as many different elements of syntax as possible so we can see how these moving parts work. And of course, it ends up in a pretty complex sentence. It's literally a complex sentence, as we'll see shortly. But to analyze the syntax then, the first thing that we want to do is pay attention to the clauses themselves, okay? And of course, when I say that, it's another term that I know students have heard, clause, clause, clause. But what the heck is it? It's good to review exactly what the definition is, okay? So what is a clause? Well, a clause is the smallest grammatical unit that can express a complete thought. Now, that's not terribly helpful, right? So we'll look at examples here. But to be able to do that, a clause has to have a subject and a verb. And some of this is probably starting to sound familiar. But the catch is that subject and verb have to be properly coordinated to convey a clear meaning. And that's important, and we'll see why in a little bit. So you've probably heard in school, and you probably remember from, way back in school, that clauses can be independent or dependent. If it's an independent clause, well, then it's a simple sentence all by itself. If it's a dependent clause, it has a subject and a verb working together properly, but it also has something else that makes it dependent, what we call a subordinating conjunction. And again, we'll look at these in just a second. So that's what we're looking for in this big sentence here. We're looking for where are the actual clauses. So there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of nouns that could be subjects, but the actual clauses are here with creature tried. That's our first clause. And then savior lifted. Those are the two clauses in the sentence. So what kind of clauses are they? Well, to see that, we're going to strip away everything else and just reduce this sentence to its core. And at its core, it's saying the creature tried to escape as its savior lifted its body. That's the core of the sentence. Now, if we look at that, we've got those two clauses, creature tried and savior lifted. One of them is independent and one of them is dependent. And what makes the second clause dependent is the subordinating conjunction. Now, to review, if you have two independent clauses and you're putting them together, that's called a compound sentence. And you may have learned in school that those coordinating conjunctions are called fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Very convenient because there's only that many and we can make a word out of them. We can make an acronym out of them, fanboys. But that's coordinating conjunctions to create compound sentences. As we said, our example here is a complex sentence. So there's no fanboys. Instead, it has a subordinating conjunction. And there's no really good acronym for these subordinating conjunctions. The one way to try to remember it is awubis, which is combining not even all of the subordinating conjunctions, but initials for many of them, like although, after, as, while, when, under, before, because, if, so. Or I'm sorry, not so, since. Since. So there's a different one. Okay, so what we have here then is as, which is our subordinating conjunction, which turns this into a complex sentence with an independent and a dependent clause. So if I separate these sentences and I say, the creature tried to escape, well, that's a complete thought. But if I pull out the dependent clause and say, as its savior lifted its body, you're left kind of like, well, what was happening as its savior lifted its body? And that's what those subordinating conjunctions do. They make it so it has to be attached to something else. Okay, so if that's the core of the sentence, what is all this other stuff going on in here? What is all of this? So let's break it down and look at all these other parts. And the short answer is that what's going on is a whole lot of phrases. We have a lot of phrases in this sentence. So the first type we have is what's called a participle phrase. And the participle itself is writhing. It's what's called a present participle with that ing form. Now you can have past participles as well with an ed form, which can get pretty confusing because, of course, ed is also just the simple past tense of most English verbs. So it gets confusing, but this is a present participle describing what the creature's doing. It's writhing in pain. Now the next phrase is what's called an appositive phrase. An appositive renames a noun. And so this whole phrase is built around a single noun that's renaming creature, and that is breed. Breed is a noun. Breed is what? It's the breed of the creature. It's renaming creature grammatically. And then all that other stuff of chinchilla, previously unknown to science, is all just part of the phrase modifying breed. So that's an appositive phrase. The next phrase we have is what's called an infinitive phrase. Now, infinitives are the base form of any verb. In Spanish, for example, all the base forms, all the infinitive forms end in R, either IR, AR, ER. But that's how the infinitives work in Spanish. Now in English, the infinitive form is a stripped down, unconjugated verb form with to in front of it, like to escape. And what we can do is we can actually use that as a type of phrase in a sentence too. You know, like I love to run. So it can look a lot like another type of phrase, which we'll talk about shortly. But this is an infinitive phrase because escape here is a verb form. Now, the one that it might look like is a prepositional phrase, because to can be a preposition. But a prepositional phrase is always made up of two parts. A preposition, and there's many of them. We see from here, I mentioned to, and then a noun, cage being the noun. That noun is called the object of the preposition. Now, in this sentence, from the cage is not the only prepositional phrase. In fact, there's quite a few. In pain, pain being a noun here, of chinchilla, chinchilla being the object of the preposition of. To science, being to being the preposition, like we said earlier, it can be a preposition as well as part of an infinitive, and then science is the object of the preposition. So prepositional phrases are very common, and one of the things that English does quite frequently is nest prepositional phrases within each other. So you can have like a whole chain of prepositional phrases, you know, like I went to the store for birthday cake for my grandma, you know, things like that. Boom, boom, boom. So those are prepositional phrases. So we've identified most of the phrases in this sentence. Now there's one weird one left though, and that is what's called an absolute phrase. And it's weird because it's almost a clause. Look at it. It's eyes scanning the surroundings. In this phrase, I have a subject, eyes, and I have a verb form, scanning. But they're not properly coordinated to stand as a clause, and that's why it's an absolute phrase, not a clause. Now, all I have to do to turn that into a complete clause is add one little helping verb. If I said, its eyes were scanning the surroundings, boom, now we've got a complete clause, and it could be a sentence by itself. But since that helping verb is missing, it just ends up working a lot like the participle phrase, writhing in pain, except it has its subject there too. So that's another type of phrase that can pop up in English and is very confusing because it looks so much like a clause. Okay, so that's a whole bunch of phrases in this sentence and gives you a basic vocabulary on how to label different parts and different complex phrases that are working in a sentence. Now, I also want to talk about our comma rules because, boy, we've got a lot of commas in this big complex sentence. So the first rule we have here is that anytime we have an introductory word, phrase, or clause, we want a comma after it. Okay, so if I say "oh" or "well" at the beginning of a sentence, I'm going to put a comma after them. Likewise, if I begin a sentence with a dependent clause, then I put a comma after it. Now, our sentence begins with its independent clause, remember, so there's no comma between them for that reason. There's lots of commas for other reasons, like, for example, the appositive phrase gets commas around it. Whenever you have what's called a non-essential appositive, then we put commas around it. Now, there is such a thing as an appositive that feels so essential to the meaning of the sentence that you wouldn't put commas around it. So if you said, like, my professor, Mr. Helmling, about this class, well, you wouldn't put a comma between it because it's kind of essential to identifying the professor. So again, English is weird, and there's all sorts of exceptions to every rule. The next commas we have here around that absolute phrase, same principle. It's non-essential. We could take it out of the sentence, and the sentence still makes sense. So anytime we have a non-essential phrase in the middle of a sentence like that, we want commas around it. So those are why all the commas are there. And that's pretty much it, right? That's everything you ever need to know about grammar. Not really. That's just a tiny part. In fact, I'll go ahead and do a bonus round here. Here we've got an additional clause that we've added in, which it would thankfully never have to see again. So its savior lifted its body from the cage, which it would thankfully never have to see again. Okay, what's this now? So I'm adding in another clause onto the sentence, and this is called a non-restrictive relative clause. And the key moving part here is the relative pronoun which, and that attaches it to the sentence. And so you might see phrases like that as well. Oh, I said phrase, I meant clauses. Sorry, clauses like that as well, because we do have a noun and a verb form properly coordinated, so it does create a clause. But the which, the relative pronoun, makes it dependent as well. So again, all sorts of crazy grammar moves and some terminology for you to be familiar with, because it might turn up as we're talking about your writing. Obviously, there is more out there to know about grammar, but that's a pretty good start, and it's a good terminology that we can use to discuss your writing. So if you need to review any of that stuff, you can always just Google those terms or rewatch the video. And if you have questions about your own writing, just let me know. Shoot me an email or something.